Hey there, and welcome back to the B2B Marketing Asia podcast. My name is Joe Escobedo, and today we're talking about story mining. What the heck is story mining, and how can it help your marketing communications? To answer that question, I have a friend of mine joining the show today, Simon Carney, who is the CEO of Click to View. Good to see you again, Simon.
Yeah, good to see you too.
I feel like
Yes,
deja vu.
story mining it. Yeah, exactly. It's interesting you're talking about the name story mining, because we just kind of we didn't really think about it. Like, we just called it story mining and it's stuck. But it's basically it's like a form of corporate journalism, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, right before this call, we had sharing a very interesting story in terms of you applying this for an organization. So I like branded journalism. What does it actually mean? Can you share the example you talked about just a minute ago?
Yeah. So this is why I wanted to talk about it. And unfortunately, I can't name the brand because we haven't got approval to talk about this as a case study yet, naming the brand. But it's a big global brand. And what we were doing was building a content calendar, which is pretty typical thing where you're deciding on a set of stories to tell over the year, and some of them might be blogs or videos or whatever. But as part of it, we proposed doing these long form interviews with a series of execs, and it ended up being like 50-hour long interviews with 50 senior execs from around the region for this organization, and really free flowing, like profile interviews. So there wasn't, the idea was to draw out the stories that they told, the stories that they knew about as part from their time in the organization. And these stories could be internal comms type stories, they could be customer stories, they could be just personal growth stories. And it was fascinating. It was quite labor intensive doing 50 hour long interviews. But we managed to find all these fascinating stories. And then we built it into, like, the content calendar became this matrix of stories, and we ended up, I think, delivering about 100, identifying 100 different stories that we could tell. But we were able to cross-reference them with the people who, because some people would tell the same story, and so you could then say, okay, here's story A about this great, customer success story, this win or something like that, and we actually would then be able to say, that was the players involved in that were actually, this country manager from Malaysia, this one from Hong Kong, and so forth. So it's really valuable. But the best thing about it was the surprise result was it was commissioned by the marketing and comms team, and they ended up being the holder of the law. LORE, in the organisation. So when people, they sort of, they became the owners of the stories, and when other parts of the organisation started talking to them about different, comms and marketing needs, they had all these stories that were already mapped out. And so I think the thing that I want to share is it actually puts the marketing and comms team in a sort of a really powerful position. As sort of, the librarians of this big global organisation, because they're the keepers of the stories, and they're the ones who are discovering the stories. And so it was just a fascinating process. And so I wanted to share about it. And obviously we at Click to View, as a content agency, we're talking to other clients about it, and trying to encourage them to go through the same process. And it's fascinating, because I'm running this agency for 10 years. But I remember when I first started, I moved from journalism into the sort of agency world. I remember thinking, gosh, every company has so many great stories that for the most part they don't see, because they're in it, and they're too involved, and they're focused on the things that they're doing. If you just let a couple of journalists loose in an organisation, these brands would be very surprised to see actually what the stories are within the company. And it's proven to be a very hard thing. It's taken like 10 years before we actually got a chance to test it, as we did with this project. But it's proven that the idea is valid.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as a journalist, a former journalist myself, I think it sounds like a really fun endeavor going in and interviewing executives. I think we do that at a very smaller scale for the podcast. So we try to do an interview beforehand. It's usually 15 minutes to understand what are the topics, because a lot of times people really struggle with that. And so one thing I try to do is listen and say, okay, what are some of the things you're passionate about? What are some of the stories you want to tell? Let's see how that fits within the format we're doing and in the audience we're doing. So I think that has been helpful in terms of finding the right themes. But I think, to your point, I love it from a broader organizational point of view. So interviewing 50 executives from different markets, like you said, connecting the dots, seeing what projects they worked on, but also finding out the stories. Because I mean, you and I think can both agree that everyone has an incredible story to tell, whether it's personally, professionally. But sometimes it's really difficult to tell the story yourself. Like even for me, telling my own story is far more challenging than me telling other people's stories.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And also, I mean, when you take on a like a job with say, for us as a content agency, there's usually a very clear target. So in fact, the story's kind of been decided before you even start. But that's not how journalism works. I mean, like you go into, you see a news story and you kind of know what it's about, but the idea is to find out all of the other bits, and the journey you might think you're heading over here, but you actually end up over there when you tell the story. But in corporate world, it doesn't work like that. Like, because everyone's, you pitch the idea and it's going this way, and you can't change course halfway through because your boss is going to hate you.
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned this is a long endeavor to get people, one, to agree to this. I'm curious because a lot of people will be asking in terms of like the execution feasibility. How did you convince 50 executives to give you an hour of their time? How did that work out?
Well, I think that we were fortunate because of COVID. So I think we'd entered phase 3. We must have started doing it once phase 3 in Singapore was open, because we had some of the people come into the office when it was appropriate, and so social distancing, the safe measures in place, obviously. But most of it was done online with Zoom calls and the like. So I think we were fortunate because of the pandemic. People weren't traveling, which is always the hard thing in these big organizations normally, because people are on planes all the time, so it would have been harder to lock down. But it did take a lot of effort. So, I mean, we were very fortunate that the comms and marketing team leadership had, fully bought into the idea, and they resourced it internally to organise that these execs came together. And I mean, I don't think I'm giving the game away, but the other thing is that the global CEO of this organisation is a former journalist as well. So I think there was a bit of there was quite a bit of buy-in from the leadership of the company, and also I think people really enjoyed it. But we had to it was quite funny. So we had to be very we had to be careful. So we said to everyone, like, this is a private discussion. Like, there's no topics you can't touch. We're not going to be, filing this off to HR afterwards or something like that. So it was very hard to get people to open up. So we had to be very candid and and try and give them a safe space just to talk. And then, as always happens, as you know, Joe, in interviews, almost invariably the most interesting things were told just as you're about to turn off the tape recorder, or even after you've turned off the tape recorder. It's like, you turn it off and they say, "Oh yeah, and there was this one story." It's like, "Oh, turn it back on again." So that's it was a really fun process, and I think I hope everyone that we interviewed got a lot out of it as well.
Yeah, exactly. I was laughing because I experienced the same thing. A lot of the more interesting things happen before or after the recording starts happening. I think it's back to, once again, just people feeling comfortable. To your point, because like I said, anytime you're being recorded, there's that sense of like, what I say kind of is stuck in stone, and it's like, yeah, people freak out. And I think, as soon as the camera
I'm freaking out right now.
Yeah, same here. So as soon as the camera goes off, you can tell, like, we'll be very relaxed, kind of let their hair down, and kind of, the conversation is a much different take to it. But I think that is a challenge: is how do you get people to open up on recording. That's always a difficult point. So you mentioned that these weren't something that were, sent to HR or were sent externally. If I'm hearing this correctly, it was this like a database that you had, and maybe marketing and comms had access to it only, or how did that work out?
So, I mean, once we did the interviews, we transcribed them, and then we, there was quite a laborious process of going through and sort of identifying the stories. And then we had a big spreadsheet where it was listed, and the first item was the story name, and then there was like a slug. We used to call it in newspapers. There's a little description of the story. Then there was like the people involved. Then there was the markets. And then there was, of course, we had to tie it all to the organization's talking points. So it was like different messaging to, this story applies to this messaging, or can apply to this messaging. And maybe might have been two messages depending on what the story was. And then cross-referencing between people. So I think that was the other really interesting thing is like, I'm sure everyone knows, like if you're doing a case study or something, or something like that, you've got to identify the people in the organization who are going to talk to it. And that's often hard. And you often pick the people based on their seniority, not their knowledge. And that can be the wrong people to have in the story. Whereas this is basically sort of identifying the people with the knowledge, the people whose story it is to tell at the outset, before you've got any purpose for the story, really. And the end result is a list of 100 different stories that we're now going through and just cherry picking the ones that are appropriate to tell at this time. So we're doing a few videos and a few blogs from that. I'd be surprised if we get through 100 in a year. That'd be awesome if we could do that. But I think this list will continue to grow and become, I suppose, an archive. The interesting thing about stories in organizations, so I've been reading a lot about this, is storytelling in organizations has whole different layers. So for instance, there's a training layer to storytelling in organizations. I think there was a case study I read about, you remember Xerox, the photocopier company? So people, the photocopier repairmen used to tell war stories, about how they fixed things, and you wouldn't believe this happened, and blah blah blah, and I had to do this, and it was identified that actually was the core sort of training and team building moments that were occurring completely informally within Xerox that were driving expertise and camaraderie in the repair teams.
It's fascinating to hear about from a training perspective as well. We've done trainings together as well. Like that element of telling stories, I think always helps resonate, because the challenge with a lot of training is sometimes you want to break it down into specific tips or strategies and so on. But going back to the initial part, like making it resonate with them. So like I tend to start a lot of my trainings with like personal stories of like, what went right, what went wrong, but also inviting other people within the organization to share theirs. Because I think that helps set the context and the tone. Otherwise, if you dive right into a training, I think it's difficult for people to really comprehend, what is the impact or what is really important for me. So I think it's a great example of like, weaving those into, whether it's trainings or onboardings or anything where you need to kind of demonstrate a certain kind of message or something like that. It's quite helpful.
Yeah, there's a thing, it's called the Velcro theory of memory, and basically memory has these like hooks, like Velcro, and stories are just the hooks. So the more stories you can weave into anything, the better it'll be remembered. Yeah,
I love that. I'm going to look that up and look more into it.
You've got to read this book called Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath. This is Made to Stick: Why Some Ideas Survive and Others Die. So I'm just basically quoting directly from their book. But it's a damn good book. I'd recommend it.
Awesome. Definitely going to include that in the show notes and check it out myself. Because I think, obviously you can't share any of the stories, but I'm curious to hear what are some of the things that stood out for you. I mean, for me, like a strong story is something that has a strong emotion to it. So, for example, it was like something that was a tremendous failure at the beginning. You kind of turned it around. So you think like the underdog stories or like the traditional story arcs of classical storytelling. Was there like something that you found interesting in interviewing 100 people that really stood out to you? Any common threads?
Yeah, I mean, I think because we live in exceptional times at the moment. The pandemic-related stories were really really touching, and how in this organisation, people had been caught, for instance, like in people, Malaysian residents working in Singapore who had to stay here and are still here. Because of the pandemic with the border closures and so forth, and some of the stories of remarkable achievement because of the pandemic. So doing things in days that would have taken months, if not years, to implement in normal times. So I mean that was amazing. Sort of identifying different opportunities from a business sense. So I think there was some really good business success stories that were coming out in a very authentic way. So it wasn't like sitting down and going, okay, what press release can we put out here? We've won this deal, and we're very proud to announce blah 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 blah. It was much more. I saw, I was watching the news one morning at home, and I saw this story about, blah, and I thought, oh, that's an opportunity. And, I rang Joe Blogs up in Ho Chi Minh and said, can we do this? And they jumped on it straight away. That sort of, so it was that anecdotal level of storytelling that you don't see in sort of press releases or a lot of corporate storytelling, which is more because it's presenting the way companies think they should be telling the story, the official version, as opposed to how it really happened.
Absolutely. As someone who's written thousands of press releases early in my days, I think that was always one of my struggles, is that, to your point, it was always like the gloss of what happened. And I think it only was very surface level. So if you're reading it, unless you're in the organization, most people are not going to read press releases. I think what they're missing, and one of my clients was reaching out to me recently and asking me, okay, can you review a story she wrote? And one thing that I noticed when I was reading it, it was very much like, oh yeah, we did this, it worked out. This was great too, this worked out. But there was no obstacles to it. So as something reading it, it was her story, but it still read like a press release. So for me, I got it gets bored
halfway. That's the challenge of any corporate storytelling is like, no one's interested in a successful company does something successfully and it was all a good success. That's boring and no one's really interested in it. And I can tell you, I haven't written many press releases because that's not what we do, but I have sat as the chief of staff on a big newspaper, and I can tell you that when you're looking at a pile of press releases this big, this is when they were still printed out and came on faxes, you were like flick, read, flick, read, flick. So you had about whoever's writing the press release had to catch your attention within, I'd say, 3 seconds tops. Yeah. And so you had to, and then if you saw something interesting, oh, okay, so you read it out a little bit, boring, so yeah. It's, so it's hard to get this, that's why stories are so important.
Absolutely. And I think it kind of goes on something I'm constantly talking about is people always relate to people. So even in B2B marketing, people always relate to people more than they do the brands. So I think a lot of people try to have these brand stories and kind of the history, and I think it works to some extent sometimes, but it's quite limited. So going back to your brand is essentially your people. So I love the concept of what you created, because you're essentially finding a systematic way to tell the individual stories. And then how do you feed that into the other things? And then even from a practical point of view,
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, that's what I love about B2B, doing B2B, which is what we do as well, because you've got that much clearer idea of the audience, and it's so much more individual to individual in terms of the way you're creating content for, as opposed to B2C, which is like some mass audience. So I really enjoy that sort of that one-to-one aspect of B2B.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is one of the advantages, and I don't think enough brands really play to that in B2B. They still market it from a B2C point of view. They're saying this is the mass audience for focusing on IT professionals or whatever it is, but they're missing out on the huge thing that you are selling to another person. Yes, you're selling to a brand, but at the end of the day, you're getting someone from marketing or IT or finance to sign off on that specific contract. So I think, once again, a lot of B2B brands haven't really got this or latched onto it. So those, I think, that do it incredibly well. There's a couple that I can name off the top of my head, but they really get it, and they really leverage their people as their resources, their experts, because that's what people are buying in B2B. They're buying your people. As much as they're saying,
Yeah.
yes, your brand is a tick. Yeah. Okay. Legitimate brand. They're buying the people behind the brand. Make sure they can strategize, execute, and so on. So same thing. That's the reason I love B2B and why we're kind of focusing on it primarily as well.
Yeah, and this is what I think about storytelling. Is it's especially telling stories in digital channels is, in a way, it's part of the digital transformation, because like a salesperson, especially in B2B, I mean, they're all full of banter, they're all full of great stories. That's how they sell, and that's how they sing for their supper. By sort of drawing out these stories and writing them down and publishing them, you're effectively, it's part of the digital transformation process, because you're codifying it, you're structuring it, organizing it, and distributing it digitally.
Absolutely, and I'm thinking of, like, because I was thinking about the Matrix and the matrices, and I think it works out perfectly, because if you are, let's say, marketing, I think they really struggle, or comms at the same time. If they have an upcoming case study or a story, a lot of times they're scrambling to find a source, to find the right person, and so on. But I think if they're having that one kind of one-stop shop where they can go ahead and they filter out, okay, this market, this message, this, and so on and so on, it makes it so much easier for them going forward. And another point that I want to bring up that I think is extremely important, we talk about, the pandemic stories are extremely important. I think timeliness of the story is important, but I also think reusing those or recycling those. I mean, God forbid there's another crisis. Let's hope not. But you could use that as something, as like okay, here's the previous context. Here's what we did to overcome this challenge. Now we're faced with this. So I think that historical kind of, predecessor in terms of stories can be an interesting way to set up the future ones, or the current ones as well too. So a lot of great ways to leverage these stories. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, from blogging and so forth, some of your blogs on your site are evergreen. So you go back to them and you look and say, okay, well, these 3 blogs were the most popular last year. Let's reboot those and update them and republish them, because they have that evergreen. There's always that interest in them. Damn it, there was something else I was going to say. I've forgotten. I'm completely forgotten.
No worries. Yeah, I absolutely agree about evergreen. I mean, even my articles from Forbes, it's been a few years since I've written for them. And even just last week, someone messaged me and they said, hey, really liked your article and so on. And they introduced me to someone in Singapore, and we're catching for coffee. So it brings me up to a great line that my previous colleague once told me, is good stories never die. And I think that's the same thing. Like, even now, I read books that are like, 40, 50 years old, but the stories themselves still resonate. They're still practical. They're still helpful. So once again, another 50, 100 years could still be applicable to a lot of folks.
Yeah, and the other thing is, by organizing them and structuring is you need to take one story, but you've got to slice it and dice it and use it in so many ways. Otherwise, it's wasted effort. Like, if we do a blog for our website, we'll post the blog, then we'll make that the lead item in our weekly newsletter. We'll dice it up into social posts. We'll create a carousel so we can sort of tell a story visually. And I haven't even got organized to be on LinkedIn Live or something like that, or doing YouTube videos. But realistically, that one piece of content, that one blog, maybe that one interview, should be used at least 10 different ways. I mean, if you're really serious about it, like, and so you're so it's a lot less effort on story gathering and storytelling, A lot more effort on publishing, digital publishing, which doesn't happen so much.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think for me, even creating is the easy part. Now I think distributing it across different channels is the difficult part. And even for even for this, I mean, we do it live, but then it's going directly recorded onto YouTube simultaneously. So we have that. And then what I can do is pull the audio, and then that goes up on the podcast on iTunes and Spotify.
Good.
And
yeah, that's what's exactly right.
Yeah. And then can transcribe it to your point and have like the show notes and everything in there. So I think, yes, you definitely need to leverage as much as possible. And one thing that I've noticed, because we have the newsletter, we have YouTube, we have the podcast now on iTunes, Spotify, is different stories and different content performs better on different channels sometimes. So I think that's a missed opportunity. Is sometimes, look, it didn't work out as a video, but it worked out great as a podcast, or great as a blog. And like I said, you don't really know that until you break it up into different formats. So that was been my key learning, and kind of experimenting with different formats and seeing what works and what doesn't work across different channels.
You're absolutely right, and you have to try it, and you have to iterate as you go, and by doing that, you become a much better content creator, much more interesting to your audience, and you can sort of where to make the hits. But it's like the old adage about advertising. Half of it works, you just don't know which half sometimes.
Exactly. And even for me, like I said, we're about almost 70 episodes in now. We started last year, and I still couldn't tell you.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's an awesome achievement. That's amazing.
Thank you. It's been a busy past year. And so, to your point, like I said, I have some good gauge in terms of what's going to work or what's out, but sometimes there are ones that just kind of completely surprise me. And I think that's like you said, the beauty of what we do is you put it out there and you see what resonates with people. And that's really, for me, why we do these kind of series, is provide practical tips to people.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. That's great.
Awesome.
70 episodes. Why haven't you had me on before?
You should have been first. I don't know why. We had to save the best for last. We're getting up there. But no, Simon, I really appreciate you coming on the show. Like I said, it's one of my inspirations when it comes to B2B. So thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing that story. I found it super, super practical. Hopefully, like I said, the folks watching will as well. Let's see. Sorry, we have
Is anyone watching?
Yes, sorry, they are.
Here we go. Wow.
Yeah, Rena says, thanks, Rena. Rena says, what makes a good story? I'm not sure if people are interested in listening to other people's stories unless they are really compelling, or the person you're interviewing is really a high-profile individual or influencer. Simon, I'll let you take that one.
It's like news judgment. So you know a good story when you hear it. So like a compelling story is overcoming a challenge. Talking about something personal, but like to what Joe was saying before, it's usually looking at in the corporate sense, I guess, looking at a problem and then talking about how you overcame various challenges and then how you solved that. It's interesting that you talked about people with high profiles and influences, and that's very true. People are going to be more interested in hearing from like high-profile individuals and influencers, and you see that especially with things like podcasts. It's very hard if you're a nobody to start a podcast and get traction, and you'll Siri is transcribing everything I'm saying for some reason. Sorry. So what was my point? So when people talk about podcasts and they say, I heard this great podcast, blah blah blah, they had such and such on, and that's how that's where word of mouth with podcasts comes on. So it's hard. For instance, if you're trying to get a successful podcast in a talk format now, I think you've really got to go into the story format, and to do that, the story's got to be compelling. It's got to be newsworthy. For instance, best podcast I've heard about just recently in Singapore is one done by a group called Aware, which is a women in business organization, and it was put together by a journalist, and it actually documents how a group of a Christian group tried to hijack and take over the organization because of something about homosexuality or something. Its position on gay rights, and they'd recorded all the meetings. So this podcast goes through sort of like how 100 people turned up at one meeting and sort of tried to take over the organisation, and that's a great story of challenge. You don't know, you kind of know how it ends, but how what happens and how did they overcome the challenge and so forth. So that was. That's a particularly good story-based podcast, for instance.
Yeah, I think you bring up a very, very good point. I think to Rena's point as well, she brings up a very good point as well, too. I think the challenge with this is everyone is looking at the very top. So if you look at the number of Jeff Bezos or the late Steve Jobs when he was doing it, like they just dominated everything. Like what Jeff Bezos eats for breakfast, like what it's like everything is him, because like he's the pinnacle of like business as the wealthiest person. But I think to your point, it goes back to who your audience as well. I mean, yes, ideally we're all trying to be that level, but let's say your audience are fresh graduates or they're current students, and say that their aspiration is to become like a mid-level manager or even get an entry-level job at a top company. So the people they're going to be focusing on is slightly lower in terms of the pyramid, but still someone they aspire to be. And I think to Rena's point, that can still be powerful in terms of reaching a specific audience without going to the top. Because obviously getting Jeff Bezos on a podcast in an interview or any of those guys at that super level are incredibly tough. So I think Simon brings some really good points in terms of location as well. I think that's the reason we focus on Asia for this podcast, is because we could go very broad, and there are podcasts that just focus on B2B in general. But I think one thing we want to do is to tell those stories because there was that local relevance. If you are in Singapore and Hong Kong or Malaysia or Indonesia, you want to hear stories from people around you. You want to see what they're going through. And you want to see people who are maybe around the same level as you or maybe a little bit higher. So I think that's something to bring up as well. But I think, Rena, you make a very valid point. I still think those top people get a lot of the opportunities. But going back to even Simon's point, it doesn't necessarily have to be the global CEO that you're interviewing. It could be, someone, maybe a mid-level manager who's doing something very fascinating, who has an incredible story to tell. Focus on that, because they're more inclined to give you the story versus the global CEO who's super time-starved. And they more likely have some interesting ones as well. Yeah.
One thing I'd add to that, Joe, is and we wrote a blog about this story mining thing, and then I quoted the Japanese novelist Murakami, and it's one of my favorite quotes because it talks about getting stuff down, telling the story, the whole publishing it, and he simply says that which is not expressed doesn't exist, and so if you don't tell the story, like you might know the best story in the world or the most interesting story, even if it's a boring story, if you don't tell it, it doesn't exist. Like it's not part of the of communication. It's not part of the experience. So you have to tell the story for anyone to have a chance first, and publish it for anyone to have a chance of seeing it, even if you're not famous, even if you're not even if it's only one or two people who are going to read it, like your mum.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of not famous people, I mean, I'm not famous by any means. And this podcast, this series has gotten 40, 50,000 monthly views and stuff like that. So there's a lot of things that people can do who are not famous. I think it goes back to how well they understand the audience, how well you're able to provide value or something, an interesting story to them as well. And I think you can still have a chance. So, Rena, very, very good question.
You don't know when it's going to pop up, like your Forbes article.
Yeah.
Like years later, somebody will be going, "Oh, I listened to this podcast and heard this that bloke Simon talking about story mining. What a silly idea that was."
Exactly, and it's funny because even like this is something to remember too, because I produce a lot of content, and one of the stories that wasn't like the best in terms of like viewership, someone messaged me, like a really prolific young podcaster, and he said, "Hey, I watched this interview you did with so and so." And I found it super helpful because I'm developing these online courses and things like that. And I was like, which one are you talking about? It's because I had to go down the list. And this one, like I said, not great in terms of viewership, but that guy's story, that guy's tips resonated with that young podcaster who's now very successful. And he says, yeah, I watched it and I've applied what he did to my business. So I think that's something
Never know
to
where
keep
it's
in
going to
mind
end
as well,
up.
too. Yeah. I think that's something to keep in mind is like a lot of times we look at these big vanity metrics in terms of the number of views, in terms of engagement. For me, I look at the quality of time they're spending. So obviously, how much time that they're listening or watching is extremely important because that shows that they're fascinating. I use that metric because I used to use views, but it's very easy for me to use a clickbaity, title and a subject line and get people to click it, but then they maybe just jump out 10 seconds later. So same thing with the websites and bounce rates. I use the same principle when it comes to videos and audio is how long are they spending? And, if they send a direct message saying, hey, it's helpful, like that means more to me than like 100,000 views, which would be nice. But those for me are more important at the moment.
Excellent.
Awesome. Rena says, thank you. Thank you so much, Rena. Like I said,
You're
really
most welcome.
Yes. Thank you so much. Well, Simon, thank you so much. It's been a thrill, my friend. I really, really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed the chat.
Absolutely. I always enjoy our chats. We'll have to do this again in person soon. But yeah, I really love the structured way in which you're developing stories across organizations. So yeah, thank you so much. And for those listening and watching, please feel free to share this. A lot of really, really practical tips on, like I said, story mining and building structures around kind of what you're doing. So thank you guys so much for listening. Thank you for watching. Stay safe. Take care. And we'll see you soon. Bye, guys.
Thanks, Joe. Bye. Bye.